The courtroom in Cape Town fell silent as the verdict was delivered. Nafiz Modack, once the untouchable figure of the Western Cape underworld, stood motionless as the judge announced his fate. 10 years in prison for corruption, 3 years suspended, leaving him to serve 7 behind bars. It was not the first time Modack's name had been splashed across headlines. For years, he was painted as a ruthless figure, a man who thrived in the shadows of Cape Town's criminal empire. From nightclub extortion rackets to bloody shootouts on suburban streets, Modack's story was one of power, violence, and betrayal. The charge that sealed his fate in 2025 seemed, on the surface, almost minor compared to the storm of crimes once attributed to him. But in truth, it cut to the heart of his empire: corruption, the exchange of cash for protection, the quiet deals between gangsters and the police meant to uphold the law. For years, Modack bought himself freedom. For years, he evaded justice. But this time, the empire he built could no longer protect him. This is the story of Nafiz Modack, his rise, his wars, his betrayals, and his fall. A tale of a man who reached the top of Cape Town's criminal hierarchy, only to be dragged back down by the same corruption that once kept him untouchable. Every underworld figure has an origin story, and Nafiz Modack's began far from the glittering lights of Cape Town's nightclubs. Born in 1981, he came of age in a city already scarred by violent gang wars. The Cape Flats had long been a breeding ground for syndicates, drug empires, and extortion rackets. The young men who rose to prominence in these communities were often shaped by the brutal reality around them, a world where survival meant choosing sides. Modack grew up with ambition sharper than most. He wasn't content with being just another street-level hustler. He had vision, not of slinging drugs on corners, but of carving out a territory that would place him among the most feared names in Cape Town. Those who knew him described a man who was calculating, persuasive, and ruthless when crossed. By the early 2000s, the underworld of Cape Town was dominated by powerful figures like Cyril Beaker, Radovan Krejcis, and other gang bosses who controlled everything from drug trafficking to nightclub security. Modack entered this arena quietly, learning the mechanics of power. He understood something that many of his contemporaries overlooked. Control of Cape Town's lucrative nightclub scene was the gateway to influence. The city's nightclubs were more than places of entertainment. They were economic engines, drawing in cash, celebrities, politicians, and international tourists. Whoever controlled the doors controlled the flow of money, protection rackets, and connections, and Modack wanted all of it. He started small, offering protection services to certain venues. But protection in Cape Town came at a cost. Those who refused often found themselves on the wrong end of intimidation, smashed property, or sudden chaos breaking out in their establishments. Word spread quickly. If you wanted peace, you dealt with Modack. But beneath his growing reputation, there was also an aura of danger. Modack had ties with street gangs, but he was not bound by them. Instead, he positioned himself as a businessman in the shadows, one who understood both money and muscle. he was not afraid to use either. As the years passed, whispers began to circulate. Whispers of his connections to corrupt law enforcement officials, whispers of his role in fixing problems before they spiraled out of control. He was still a rising name, but already his fingerprints were appearing in places that mattered. Cape Town's underworld had a new player, and his name was Nafiz Modack. By the mid-2000s, Cape Town's underworld was shifting. Old power players were either dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. Cyril Beaker, once a dominant nightclub security boss with intelligence connections, had been assassinated in 2011. Other gang lords were weakened by police crackdowns and internal wars. Into this vacuum stepped Nafiz Modack. Modack was not just another thug demanding protection money. He was organized, strategic, and ambitious. He established what became known as a security takeover, forcing Cape Town's most popular nightclubs and restaurants to dump their existing security companies and accept his services instead. His crew moved in like a wave, and one by one, establishments fell under his control. To businessmen and club owners, Modack presented himself as a professional security provider. But behind the polished front, the reality was intimidation and coercion. Those who resisted found themselves facing harassment, vandalism, or worse. Within months, his name was circulating in whispers among Cape Town's elite nightlife circles. Modack was in charge now. He was flamboyant in his rise. Known for driving luxury cars and surrounding himself with bodyguards, Modack projected the image of a man untouchable. He wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He was a public figure. He attended court cases, dressed in designer suits, walked the streets with a swagger, and made no secret of his growing wealth. But with visibility came enemies. Rival security bosses accused him of using brute force and Mafia-style tactics to dominate the industry. Former allies who felt squeezed out turned against him. And above all, the police began to pay attention. Yet even under scrutiny, Modack seemed untouchable. Corruption allegations swirled, with rumors that senior officers were on his payroll. Investigators struggled to pin him down. Cases collapsed, witnesses went silent, and evidence mysteriously disappeared. For ordinary Cape Town residents, Modack became a symbol of a bigger truth. The underworld and law enforcement were deeply entangled. To many, he was not just another gangster. He was a boss who had found a way to bend the system itself. And in the nightclub scene, there was no doubt Nafiz Modack had risen. He was the new power broker, the man whose name carried both fear and respect. But in Cape Town's underworld, every rise comes with a price. Rival factions were already preparing to push back, and blood would soon follow. With the nightclub scene under his grip, Nafiz Modack set his eyes on something bigger, building an empire that would place him on par with Cape Town's most feared underworld bosses. He was no longer satisfied with controlling the doors of clubs. He wanted to control the pipelines of money that flowed through the city. To achieve this, Modack began forging alliances. He connected with gang leaders from the Cape Flats, men who controlled drug distribution networks and commanded fear across neighborhoods. But unlike many of them, Modack positioned himself not as a street enforcer, but as a businessman. He provided logistics, muscle, and most importantly, connections to law enforcement and political figures. The empire was built on three pillars: security, extortion, and corruption. Security was the public front. His teams patrolled clubs and restaurants, giving the illusion of legitimacy. Extortion was the reality behind the curtain. Owners paid not for safety, but for protection from Modack's own network of intimidation. Corruption was the glue that held it all together. Payments made to police officials, investigators, and even high-ranking officers to make sure cases against him went nowhere. One of Modack's most infamous partnerships was with Brigadier Kalindran Govender, a senior police officer who eventually pleaded guilty to corruption charges. Govender became a key figure in protecting Modack's empire. For a price, he ensured investigations stalled, evidence vanished, and Modack's assets, like his luxury cars, were shielded from seizure. The Hawk's later investigation revealed how deep this rot went. Modack had paid Govender 146,000 rand in gratification for special treatment. It was this very alliance that would eventually bring both men down. But in those years, it made Modack feel invincible. His empire extended further. In neighborhoods under gang control, Modack brokered deals, playing one faction against another. He supplied financial backing for certain operations, gaining loyalty in return. His name carried weight far beyond the city's nightclubs. It reached into drug routes, smuggling operations, and loan shark rackets. But power in Cape Town's underworld is never without violence. Rival factions saw Modack's expansion as a threat to their survival. Soon, the streets would run with blood as the empire he built clashed with the old guard who refused to bow. For Nafiz Modack, the empire was growing, but so too were the enemies circling around him. By the late 2000s, Cape Town's underworld was a battlefield. Old bosses and new power players fought for dominance, and Nafiz Modack was right in the center of it. His aggressive takeover of nightclub security and his expanding empire brought him into direct conflict with rivals who refused to surrender their turf. One of the earliest flashpoints came with his showdown against Mark Liffman, a businessman long linked to underworld dealings and nightclub security. Liffman had established deep roots in the industry, and Modack's arrival threatened to dismantle his hold. Their feud spilled into the open, with violent clashes erupting outside nightclubs and in the streets. The city's nightlife became a war zone, as competing crews faced off in an escalating turf battle. The gang wars extended beyond nightclub doors. On the Cape Flats, alliances shifted like sand. Rival gangs, such as the 27s and 28s, watched Modack's rise with suspicion. His growing influence made him a target, and attempts were made to cut him down before he became too powerful. But Modack was no stranger to violence. In 2017, a dramatic shootout in Greenpoint shocked Cape Town. Gunmen opened fire on a convoy linked to Modack, leaving cars riddled with bullets and bystanders terrified. It was a message from his enemies. He was not untouchable. The violence escalated further in 2020, when Modack was linked to the assassination attempt on Charles Kinnear, a top anti-gang detective who had been investigating his empire. Kinnear survived one attempt, but in September 2020, he was gunned down outside his home in Bishop Lavis. The murder sent shockwaves through South Africa, exposing the dangerous nexus between organized crime and law enforcement corruption. While Modack denied involvement, investigators repeatedly tied his name to the conspiracy. The wars weren't only fought with bullets, they were fought in courtrooms too. Rival bosses accused each other publicly, and Cape Town's media reported daily on the bloody saga. Modack's image became that of a man constantly in the crosshairs, both as a target of assassination attempts and as the alleged mastermind behind retaliatory strikes. In these years, Cape Town became a city living under the shadow of its gang wars. Residents in suburban neighborhoods heard gunfire echo through the night. Business owners paid protection money just to keep their doors open. And in the middle of it all, Nafiz Modack's name loomed large. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the game became. With every assassination attempt, with every bloody feud, the law was drawing closer. The gang wars had made him infamous, but they had also painted a giant target on his back. In the underworld, power attracts both loyalty and betrayal. For Nafiz Modack, survival was a daily battle, not just against rival bosses, but against former allies who turned on him when the stakes grew too high. By the early 2020s, Modack's name was linked to a series of violent plots. His enemies were not only other gangsters, but also detectives, journalists, and even members of his own crew who feared he had become too powerful. In Cape Town's criminal world, alliances shifted overnight, and betrayal was as common as gunfire. The attempt on his life in 2017 was only the beginning. Reports surfaced of multiple assassination attempts targeting Modack. Gunmen followed his movements, waiting for a chance to strike. In one notorious attack, a convoy of cars linked to him was riddled with bullets, but Modack escaped unscathed. To some, it was proof that he was untouchable. To others, it was a sign that his days were numbered. Survival hardened him. He began moving with heavily armed bodyguards, traveling in armored vehicles, and surrounding himself with layers of protection. Ordinary citizens saw him arrive at court hearings flanked by men in tactical gear, more like a warlord than a businessman. But violence was not his only enemy. Inside his circle, cracks began to show. Associates accused him of hoarding power, of making deals that endangered others, of dragging everyone into his personal wars. Whispers of betrayal grew louder. Some of his closest allies struck secret bargains with rivals or even the police, feeding information in exchange for protection. One of the darkest betrayals came with the murder of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kinnear, the anti-gang detective whose investigations threatened to dismantle Modack's empire. While Modack denied direct involvement, investigators claimed that corrupt police officers had leaked information about Kinnear's surveillance of Modack's network. That betrayal, from within law enforcement itself, ended with Kinnear's brutal assassination in September 2020. For Modack, betrayal was everywhere. In the courtroom, witnesses flipped under pressure. On the streets, rivals plotted against him. Even within his supposed alliances, loyalty came with a price tag. The empire he built was powerful, but it was also fragile, a house of cards propped up by fear, corruption, and shifting loyalties. Still, Modack survived. Each attempt on his life, each betrayal, seemed only to add to his legend. To his supporters, he was a man too strong to be broken. To his enemies, he was a dangerous figure whose time would eventually come. But survival in Cape Town's underworld was never permanent. Every escape, every betrayal left scars, and the law was preparing its final blow. Every criminal empire needs protection. For some, it's muscle on the streets. For Nafiz Modack, it was money in the hands of the law. From the early days of his rise, Modack understood a crucial rule. If you can't beat the police, pay them. His empire thrived not just on fear and violence, but on the quiet complicity of officers willing to turn a blind eye for a price. The most notorious of these connections was Brigadier Kulindran Govender, a senior officer whose position gave Modack access to a level of immunity few criminals ever enjoyed. Investigations later revealed that Modack paid Govender 146,000 rand in gratification, cash exchanged for special treatment. In practice, this meant ongoing investigations were delayed, evidence disappeared, and key assets, like Modack's Mercedes-Benz, were never seized despite being central to criminal cases. Govinder's influence was extensive. He prevented cooperation between SAPS officers investigating Modack and other units, effectively ensuring that cases would stall or collapse entirely. With a corrupt senior officer in his corner, Modack moved with confidence. Rival bosses could attack him, witnesses could come forward, but the police would rarely intervene effectively. Yet this alliance was not purely transactional. It was a partnership in strategy. Govinder and Modack coordinated to protect the empire from both legal scrutiny and rival threats. Modack gained time, opportunity, and space to expand, while Govinder profited personally, gaining money and influence within criminal networks. Corruption of this scale created a dangerous ecosystem. Officers who tried to do their job were silenced or threatened. Investigations became a game of negotiation rather than justice, and Modack, ever calculating, exploited it masterfully. But corruption is a double-edged sword. The very protection that allowed Modack to rise also planted the seeds of his downfall. The Hawks' Serious Corruption Investigation Unit eventually uncovered the link between Modack and Govinder, tracing payments and communications that proved complicity. The empire that seemed untouchable was suddenly vulnerable. What had once been a source of invincibility, the law itself bending in his favor, now became the evidence that would convict him. For years, Nafiz Modack had operated in the shadows, protected by muscle, money, and corruption. But even the most carefully constructed empires leave traces, and the Hawks' Serious Corruption Investigation Unit began connecting the dots. The investigation focused on Modack's relationship with Brigadier Kalindran Govinder, the senior police officer who had facilitated the protection of Modack's assets and delayed investigations. Financial records, witness testimony, and digital communications revealed a network of gratification payments totaling 146,000 rand exchanged for preferential treatment. The evidence was irrefutable. Modack had acted with common purpose with Govinder, ensuring investigations into his operations stalled. Vehicles like his prized Mercedes-Benz, which should have been seized as part of ongoing probes, remained untouched. Officers assigned to the case were blocked from cooperating, undermining the rule of law itself. Investigators also uncovered Modack's broader network of intimidation and bribery. Witnesses came forward under protective measures, exposing the system of coercion he had built around nightclubs, crews, and street gangs. Rival bosses confirmed the reach of his influence, detailing threats, extortion, and violence used to maintain his empire. As the case progressed, it became clear that Modack's downfall was not a sudden strike of fate, but the result of years of careful law enforcement work. For the first time, the scale of his corruption was exposed. The man who seemed untouchable was vulnerable. By the time Modack was brought to court, the evidence was overwhelming. Years of survival, assassinations, betrayals, and manipulation culminated in a courtroom where the law finally held him accountable. It was a turning point. The empire he had built with blood, money, and fear was beginning to crumble. The courtroom in Cape Town was tense on the 19th of September 2025, the day Nafiz Modack faced the consequences of a decade-long reign over the city's underworld. Cameras flashed as reporters documented the arrival of the man who had once seemed untouchable. Modack, 44, sat quietly, his signature confidence tempered by the weight of the charges against him. He had survived assassination attempts, betrayals, and gang wars. He had manipulated corrupt officers and eluded justice for years. Yet now, the full force of the law was closing in. The judge outlined the charges: corruption, for payments made to Brigadier Kalindran Govinda in exchange for preferential treatment, and the obstruction of justice. The details of the case were damning: 146,000 rand in gratification, active interference in police investigations, and the protection of assets that should have been seized. After deliberation, the verdict was delivered: 10 years imprisonment, with 3 years suspended for 5 years, leaving Modack to serve an effective 7 years behind bars. For the first time, the man who had ruled Cape Town's nightclubs, security crews, and criminal networks faced direct consequences for his actions. Reactions outside the courtroom were mixed. Some celebrated the victory of law enforcement over organized crime. Others whispered about the gaps that remained in the system, the continuing influence of corruption, and the underworld's resilience. But for Nafiz Modack, there was no escaping the reality of a prison sentence. Inside, he faced a reckoning not only for the corruption charges, but also for the empire he had built on intimidation, betrayal, and the bending of the law. The streets he once controlled were no longer his, and the alliances he had forged were already fracturing. Sentencing day was not just a legal judgment. It was the symbolic fall of a kingpin who had long seemed untouchable. For the city of Cape Town, it was a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is beyond the reach of justice. Nafiz Modack's reign over Cape Town's underworld is over. Behind bars, the man who once seemed untouchable faces the reality of his empire collapsing. Nightclubs he controlled are under new management. Crews that once followed his orders are scattered, many absorbed by rival factions. The streets he ruled no longer bear his mark. His story is a stark lesson in the fragility of power, built on fear, corruption, and violence. Modack survived bullets, betrayals, and assassination attempts. Yet it was the law, not rival gangs, that finally brought him down. The very system he manipulated became the instrument of his downfall. For Cape Town, his fall is both a relief and a warning. The underworld may continue to thrive, but Modack's sentencing proves that even the most entrenched criminal networks are not invincible. Corruption, once a shield, can also become a trap. Alliances forged in fear can dissolve in the face of justice. And so, the empire of Nafiz Modack crumbles. His legacy is a mixture of fear and fascination, a chapter in Cape Town's criminal history that will be remembered for the violence, the intrigue, and the ultimate reckoning. In the end, the city remains, scarred but vigilant, a constant battleground where power is fleeting, and the line between law and lawlessness is always tested. The kingpin has fallen. The story of Nafiz Modack is a cautionary tale, one that echoes through the streets of Cape Town long after the courtroom doors closed.